All right, thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, happy Friday, and welcome to the Faster Payments Task Force session for September 18th. I'm Mike Vandervelde with the Federal Reserve, and I'll be your facilitator. Today's topic explores the question, how can I weigh in on requirements for a faster payment system? And before we begin, let me jump to slide number 2 and talk about the logistics of the call. This call is being recorded and will be made available at fedpaymentsimprovement.org in the coming days. If you have not done so yet, go ahead and click on the webinar link that you received after registering. This option does offer some benefits. You can watch the slides as they're advanced. You can type questions to us. You can participate in polling questions. You can also download the session materials through that material button. You can also choose to listen to the audio of this call through your PC speakers. Now, I do want to make a special note about that. The performance does depend on your connection, so if at any time you're having issues in the webinar space or the audio there, just pick up the phone and dial the toll-free number. All right, let me be the first to welcome and thank our presenter. That's Connie Theien. Connie is a vice president from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. As I mentioned earlier, you can submit questions today by clicking the Ask Question button in the lower left-hand corner of the webinar tool. And we are going to be addressing those questions throughout the call and then designate a Q&A section at the end. All right, with that said, I'm going to start us off with a polling question today. So grab your mouse, and appearing on your screen in just a moment is going to be a question that can also be seen on slide number 3. I'll also read it out loud. Please choose the option that best describes your organization. Is it a financial institution, an end user, such as a merchant, government, consumer interest organization, a non-bank provider, such as technology provider or network operator, or other, academic, consultant, regulator, etc. So go ahead and just click on your selection there and let us know a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from today. And I'm going to stall here for just a couple more moments. And, all right, I think that's probably good. I'm going to go ahead and stop, and I'm going to share these results back with you now. So it looks like 55% of you are a financial institution, and then there's a mix of some others there. So great. Thank you for that. I am going to stop that, and we're going to jump over to slide number 4, and I'm going to turn this over to Connie.
Great. Thanks, Mike, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to our participants on the East Coast. We really appreciate you taking time to join us today and your interest in the work of the Faster Payments Task Force. Today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what's going on with the Faster Payments Task Force and specifically the work they are doing to develop effectiveness criteria for a faster payments capability. I'll talk about the process that has been used to develop and refine those criteria. And then most important, we'd like to spend time today really exposing you to some of the key questions that are being debated as part of the development of these criteria, give you an opportunity to weigh in on a couple of these through flash polling, but then most important, to talk about opportunities in the coming weeks for you to provide substantive feedback on these effectiveness criteria. So before we get started, moving on to slide 5, it would be helpful to us to know how many of you participated in our Faster Payments Task Force overview webinar earlier this week on Tuesday. So, Mike, take it away with our polling question number 2.
Yeah, thank you. So appearing on your screen right now is the question, and it quite simply is asking, did you attend that September 15th webinar on what's happening with the Faster Payments Task Force? A simple yes or no, just make that selection there. I'll give you just a few seconds to do that. And that is probably enough time. I'm going to go ahead and stop that now, and let's take a look. So it looks like, I'm sorry, I just showed the results from the previous poll. Let me show these results now. So it looks like almost 75% of you did attend, so that's great.
Great. All right, well, that is helpful. I will keep my background comments fairly brief, given that most of you were on Tuesday's call. those of you who weren't, if after my remarks you're seeking more information, there are a couple of ways that we'd be happy to follow up with you. One, there's lots of information, background on the Faster Payments Task Force on fedpaymentsimprovement.org, or you can certainly either through the website or the webinar poll make a request to us for personal follow-up if you have questions on some of what's brought us to the webinar today. But moving on, a little bit of context before we get started on criteria. On slide 6, we describe the work that's underway as part of the Federal Reserve Strategies for Improving the U.S. Payment System. We issued a paper outlining a number of strategies to support our desire for improvements to the speed, security, and efficiency of payments, both domestic and cross-border, and our desire to achieve those improvements through collaboration with stakeholders. There are 5 strategies in that paper. Today we're here to talk about strategy 2, which is to identify effective approaches for implementing safe, ubiquitous, faster payment capabilities in the U.S. We are pursuing that strategy by establishment of the Faster Payments Task Force. This slide outlines exactly what that task force has been charged with, and that is to not only identify potential alternative approaches for achieving faster payments capabilities, but to evaluate those approaches in order to determine which approaches would be effective for implementation. So aside from, representing the task force members, representing their views and helping to define what the future needs are, and we're doing that in the form of these effectiveness criteria that we're talking about today, they will then assess alternative approaches against those effectiveness criteria. And even beyond that important activity, they will identify other issues, strategic gaps, issues, things that need to be addressed by collectively the stakeholders of the payment system in order for any approach to be successfully implemented and adopted. So a very big charge and a lot of work and thinking to be done by the Faster Payments Task Force. Moving on to slide 7. Slide 7 describes how the task force is going about this work. It's in 3 phases, and we are solidly in phase 1, which is focused on planning the work. I'll talk in a minute about the activities going underway as part of phase 1, but it's largely around developing the process by which these approaches will be identified and evaluated to determine effective options. Phase 2 is, gets into the execution of that process, and it's focused on iterative development of these ideas, approach ideas, and then assessment of those against the criteria. And last, phase 3 will encompass publishing all of the work, the outcomes, the observations of the task force through this process. And we expect the entire work of the Faster Payments Task Force to complete by the end of 2016. Moving on to slide 8, a little bit more detail about the work that's actively underway that you can follow through Faster Payments Task Force documentation on the website and webinars and opportunities like this. The first really important decision and work of the task force was to figure out how this group of 320 registered members were going to make decisions and produce and publish work products. And so in the first 60 days, we worked together with the task force to outline the decision-making framework. It was approved on September 3rd, and it articulates a process by which ultimately we achieve this desire to gain very broad agreement and consensus across all of the diverse stakeholders and perspectives involved in the task force, and that we think are representative of the diverse perspectives in the industry. And so the decision-making framework requires a supermajority approval of the task force membership on any decision or work product for endorsement. It also requires a majority of 7 of 8 stakeholder segments represented on the task force. If you've followed the task force very closely, you might be familiar with the fact that it's really, the membership is divided into stakeholder segments, and there are 8, including small financial institutions, medium, large FIs, end users, including government, business, and consumer representatives, non-bank payment service providers, and then other payment system enablers, including rules and standards organizations, consultants, researchers, trade associations, all of those types of participants. And so in order for a decision to be made, a majority of stakeholders in each of those segments, 7 out of 8, need to support the decision or work product. So we're excited, that there was so much agreement that kind of collaboration and consensus will be important to the successful outcome, not just of the task force work, but of implementation and adoption of the kinds of approaches and solutions that go forth. So important first thing, a check mark after the decision-making framework. Effectiveness criteria, we're here to talk about that today at length. But beyond the effectiveness criteria, the other important aspect of this planning process is to, in a very detailed way, outline this proposal process architecture. And that encompasses everything from how will proposals be developed by work groups, who can participate in those work groups, what should proposals look like, what kind of information will be needed to do an effective assessment of an idea, how will those proposals iterate, all the way from kind of people having ideas for various components and bringing those together into a full, wholesome proposal that's end-to-end, through the assessment process. How will we assess or evaluate these approaches? What kind of methodology would be used for assessing them? And then what will the final assessment results look like? And how will we move to approve and publish those? So the planning of all of the details and components of that process is underway now and is a key deliverable of this phase 1 work. So let's move on, and perhaps before we dive into the effectiveness criteria, which will be the remainder of our discussion today, I'll just pause and ask Mike if any questions have been submitted, particularly for those folks who didn't get the hour version of that background on Tuesday.
All right, very good. I want to give a quick reminder there. You can click that Ask Question button and type one in right there. And we'll be able to get that question addressed. Sorry, I was reading here. So let me start with the first one here. It says, will the first webinar from September 15th be available to view? And Connie, I know we talked about that being available after a few days, and that will be the case. So early next week, we'll have that available and up there on the website. The next question, though, is pertinent to your content. It does say, how do we define supermajority?
Thanks for that question. So the supermajority, and I should pull the decision-making framework up here, but if my memory is good, I believe it was 2/3 consensus of the ballots cast. And when folks vote, they can actually, task force members can choose to approve or endorse the decision. They can stand aside. So we projected scenarios where task force members felt that they didn't have the subject matter expertise or perhaps interest in a particular decision being made, so that they could explicitly sort of recuse themselves and stand aside from a particular decision. Or they can object. And one of the, I think, the most constructive aspects of the framework is that they are asked to provide alternatives, to express their concerns with the proposal on the table, provide alternative solutions that would help to drive us to consensus. So that's sort of a little more detail on the voting process, but in specific answer to your question, the supermajority of the full task force membership is a 2/3 bar.
All right, very good. And another question came in asking what that percentage is, and you just answered it, so that was great. All right, let me do a quick refresh there. Looks like that is it for now.
All right, well then let's dive into faster payments effectiveness criteria. On slide 9, we really highlight, and this is important, the purpose of these criteria. As we focused on standing up the Faster Payments Task Force and began to think about, the process for identifying effective approaches, it was very clear at the outset that it would be important for the task force to agree on what is needed from a faster payments capability in order to determine what would be an effective approach. And so, initially these were conceived of as a way to support this assessment, a framework that the task force would use to identify effective approaches. And that is, very much an important purpose of the effectiveness criteria. As we began work on them, though, and discussion within the task force, members really emphasized that an equal and perhaps in some folks' minds even more important purpose of this document would be to, and of these criteria, would be to inform the marketplace. So they essentially, as the 300 members of the task force, develop these criteria that are a description really of stakeholder needs and reflect all of the diverse opinions and views of the stakeholders on the task force, that description of stakeholder needs would be really valuable to the private sector in guiding their innovation, their faster payments product and capability and service development. And so, the task force has noted that as an equal and important purpose, and there will be efforts to, get these final criteria out and available and in the marketplace and create really broad awareness of them so that the market can take advantage of them and use them as, some essentially industry guidelines for faster payment needs. So want to make sure that we kind of acknowledge the dual purpose of the effectiveness criteria. Today we're going to talk a lot about the assessment and some of the issues that the task force is grappling with as we try to finalize these criteria. And moving on to slide 10, I'll give you a little bit of background in just how these are being developed. Way back in June, when we kicked off and had our first in-person meeting with the Faster Payments Task Force, we had lots of discussion about what needs to be encompassed in these criteria. We also, obviously, as input to our strategies paper, has spent a couple of years studying faster payments and what's needed and what are the attributes of various systems around the world. And so in taking both the task force input from the June meeting and our past research and work on the issue, we took a stab at putting some things down on paper. We actually began in June with drafting some pieces parts and having some small group task force meetings to weigh in on the pieces parts. And then on the heels of that, we brought them all together in one first draft for the full task force to weigh in on. We've done surveys within the task force to gather lots of detailed feedback on the document. We've had discussions in steering committee meetings and task force calls. We've also convened some subject matter experts on some specific working groups. We've got an active working group looking at legal and governance issues. We've got an active working group that was chartered by the Secure Payments Task Force that is looking at security criteria specifically. And we're now moving to the point where, you know, we're feeling like we're getting close on a solid draft that reflects task force views, and we're initiating this outreach to stakeholders who are not on the task force through this webinar and a survey that I'll talk about in a moment. So it's a very iterative process, working to get feedback from all task force members, from the Secure Payments Task Force, from the community, and from, you know, specific subject matter experts on some of the issues we're defining in the document. Very iterative. We expect to bring a final document to the task force for approval in the November timeframe. And so hope to be publishing and promoting and sharing with you and the broad payments industry a final faster payments effectiveness criteria document toward the end of the year. Moving on to slide 11. So what does the criteria document look like? Here you can see that the criteria have been organized around 6 categories: ubiquity, efficiency, safety and security, speed, governance, and legal. And within those categories, there are specific criteria addressing issues related to that high-level topic. The criteria are designed to create a high-level description of the desired capability. The intent is not to be so detailed as to prescribe a specific solution. So they're high-level descriptions of, you know, the desired attributes or needs. The criteria are, when you see the full document and you begin to read them, it quickly becomes obvious that, you know, the criteria are interrelated, and in some cases they are complementary, and in other cases they're almost contradictory. In other words, there would be trade-offs. If you prioritized or emphasized or were very effective in one aspect, it might lower your effectiveness in another regard. So the classic example, of course, of that is related to things like cost or time to implement. You know, there's often discussion in the industry about you could have, you know, really fabulous, the strongest security, technical security available in the market today, but is that a trade-off with usability, or is it a trade-off with cost? So this is, you know, it's a comprehensive list. It's difficult as you go through these to look at each of them independently and think about how to score it without going off and sort of tying in other related aspects. But the document attempts to specify, on all of these attributes what the desired state is. Where we believe we may reflect some of these interdependencies is as we design the assessment or evaluation method, perhaps there are weightings that help to reflect priorities of certain categories of criteria over others. That's something that's to be determined, but is something that the task force is grappling with. How do you reflect those interrelationships, and how do they affect your assessments? One of the other things that's been discussed and is still being debated is, is there a subset of these criteria that essentially are minimum requirements, that for an approach or a solution to be viable, it just has to score well, it has to be very effective on this subset. And lots of debate going on there. Not sure where it will come out, but something being considered as we, again, design that assessment process. Last but not least, I would note here that one of the very early observations was that it's important that we are all using terminology consistently and that we have some shared understanding and meaning to particular terms when we're talking about these criteria. And so we've worked on a glossary of terms to support this work, and so that as you're reading it, you can reference and know exactly what we mean when we use the word account or non-bank provider or ubiquity. What do we mean by the term ubiquity? So as a companion piece, we're publishing next week a first iteration. It'll be a living, breathing document, but a first iteration of a glossary of terms that will be helpful reference when you read the draft of these criteria. So I talked about a survey. Our intent is in the next couple of weeks to release a draft of all of these criteria, a very large, robust document, to the website with communications to folks like you who are in our stakeholder community. And you'll be able to read the criteria document, but we will also be releasing a survey that will give you an opportunity to give us feedback on some of the tough issues. So we'll kind of highlight in the way the survey is designed some of the sticky issues that we're grappling with and get your directional feedback on some of those issues. There will also be an opportunity for those of you who want to invest even more time and provide feedback on any or all of the individual criteria, that you can go in and read the criteria and then give us some sort of quantitative, responses. So we can get a measure of, do you feel like these are on the right track? So is it clear and accurate? Yes, very clear and accurate, all the way down to I'm really, grappling with this and think it needs more work to be clear. We'll also look to get a sense from you about how important you feel any particular criteria is. So a lot of latitude in this survey for you to just weigh in on a few key topics or invest the time to really weigh in and give us some feedback on all of the criteria. Again, I'll note at the end, if you want to ensure that you get notification when these are published and available, the best way to do that is to subscribe on fedpaymentsimprovement.org. We'll close out. That's on the last slide, so you don't have to remember the URL, but we may have been lucky to get to you for this webinar today through a number of, promotions and mechanisms, but the people who've subscribed will get alerts when those documents and surveys are available. All right, so that is an overview of the criteria and the upcoming opportunity to participate. The other thing we wanted to do on today's call is take advantage of having you here and get some, gut reaction and directional feedback from you on a couple of these sticky issues that we're debating. And we have an in-person Faster Payments Task Force meeting on Monday and Tuesday. And the task force is spending a good 3 or so hours debating a number of these issues and trying to advance and get us closer to a final disposition of them in the criteria document. And so we intentionally scheduled this webinar today, Friday, so that we could go back with a little bit of community feedback to inform those task force discussions. So on this slide, we've circled a few of these criteria that have generated lots of healthy debate and that we want to talk with you about today. So let's move on and do that. On slide 12, we tackle ubiquity. And one of two you can appreciate, I think, in all of our discussions with folks about our strategies paper and some of these issues over the last couple of years. Ubiquity is always a term that, there's some ambiguity around, and it generates lots of debates about exactly, one, how do you define that, and two, how would you achieve it? And so the criteria attempt to do both of those things. And criteria U1 describes accessibility, which we see as the ability for consumers, businesses, and other end users to be able to send and receive payments to and from each other. Fairly simple concept at the highest level, but when you dig down, what does that mean and what would it take for broadly all end users to be able to send and receive payments to each other? And what does that suggest for desired attributes in a faster payments capability? So some of the issues we're looking to capture in this criteria, include what types of accounts should be included. What should end user expectations be that they can send and receive payments from all deposit-taking institutions? So, we think of those as financial institutions, banks, credit unions. What about other regulated provider of accounts, non-banks who are regulated, subject to money transmitter regulations, but not banks? Should the criteria, express that is desirable? And then, that as contrasted with even other service providers who are involved in the payment flow but perhaps don't hold funds or provide accounts. So a few different definitions and trying to figure out what the criteria should really designate as ideal. This is focused on, assessing, can the solution demonstrate how consumers and businesses using the capability can be sure that their payments reach any and all payees. Some of the things being debated is, when you think about that, all consumers, businesses, does the solution support multi-currency payments? Would that be an important part of, ubiquity, accessibility? How does the solution address the needs of the unbanked or underserved? An example of that would be, does it support the ability to make payments to or from regulated non-bank access points? In a nutshell, how does the solution provide a credible plan for achieving widespread adoption? That is what, all of these questions drive to, is what is required and how can solutions drive widespread adoption? So it considers the technical feasibility for providers to adopt it, as well as the, incentives. How do you incent or require participants, providers in the space, to make it available to end users? Interoperability fits into this too. If an approach suggests, multiple operators, networks, providers, then how do they solve for the interoperability that would be needed for, widespread accessibility? So those are some of the things, that we're trying to capture and define as part of this accessibility criteria. And today, we're going to ask you a quick polling question. I appreciate that some of your questions or comments or feedback on this might be more nuanced than we're able to capture in a flash poll. And so we're going to go ahead and do the polling question, but I'm also going to suggest that if you'd like to provide us with a comment on any of the issues or this particular criteria, use our question tool, submit a question, and rather than submit a question, maybe just type comment on the front of your statement, and we'll take your feedback in that way. So let me turn it over to Mike for the polling question.
All right, very good, thank you. So this one's going to work a little bit differently. I'm actually going to push this question out right now, and for most of you, it's just going to pop up on your screen in a new web page, and for others, you might get a little box that says click here first. Either way, it's going to take you to this web page, and you're going to see actually a few polling questions, but we're really just going to deal with the first one right now. And this mechanism allows you to make multiple selections to your answer. So if more than one applies, go ahead and check those boxes, and that's why we're doing this one a little bit differently. And then if you would, just go ahead and leave this open, and we'll come back to it later on in the presentation to ask the other questions. So let me read that out loud right now. It says, faster payments solutions should be considered effective when end-user payments can be sent and received from A, depository institution accounts eligible for a Federal Reserve Bank account, for example, commercial banks, saving banks, credit unions, etc. B, regulated non-bank provider accounts, such as money transmitters. Or C, unregulated non-bank provider accounts, and that's loyalty points accounts, prepaid accounts, etc. So again, you can make multiple selections here to whichever you think apply. And then if you would, just leave that open, and we'll come back to it a little bit later. So for now, let me go ahead and take this opportunity just to ask a quick question, if I could, that came in. It says, is the task force planning to address any legal exposures created when speed is given preference over safety?
So you'll see, if you look back on the criteria framework, that there is a legal section. So the proposals would be asked to address the legal frameworks under which the proposed approach would operate. And the proposer might also point out how maybe there are gaps in existing legal frameworks relative to the kind of approach they're proposing. Perhaps it's a new system or infrastructure. And so there's an aspect of the proposal process where they'll need to address the relevant legal frameworks and needs. Some of that will also be addressed by that sort of parallel process I talked about, where the task force is charged with addressing strategic issues or gaps that the industry needs to consider to support successful implementation and adoption. And so if there are gaps in, legal or regulatory frameworks or requirements or compliance, that might be highlighted by the task force in that work. Compliance is a piece, if you look in the safety and security criteria, compliance is, a specific aspect of the safety and security criteria. So solutions would need to demonstrate that they're able to comply with existing, or if they propose new, requirements as part of their solution. So I would presume that that would be an emphasis of proposers, and they wouldn't propose speed or other things that make it impossible for them to comply with some of the security requirements. You're highlighting an issue, an example of that debate of trade-offs and some of the reasons why some of the folks on the task force suggested minimum viable criteria. Is your proposal even viable if it doesn't meet some absolute threshold of safety? It has to be effective on these. And there are other criteria I think that people have suggested might be minimum viable. So a very good question and an issue that's being debated.
All right, very good. So I believe that is all the questions that we have for this moment. And with that said, again, the poll that just was pushed out through that web page, just minimize that for now. We'll come back to it in a little bit. But for now, we're ready to continue.
All right, let's move on then to slide 14. And criteria challenge number 2. Again, in the ubiquity category, designing a criteria around the applicability of a solution to multiple use cases. And, what does this mean? It's, how does the proposed, solution support different types of payments or use cases, and how will it adapt to new use cases over time? And as it relates to use cases, there has been debate about should the criteria prioritize a subset of use cases that are currently not well served as it relates to speed. Many of you are probably familiar with the faster payments assessment that the Federal Reserve conducted last year with the support of McKinsey and Company. And as part of that, we did an assessment of 11 different use cases and determined which use cases had a need for speed in some aspect of the payment process that was not currently being met. And the 5 listed here are those use cases that were identified as would potentially benefit from enhanced speed of payments. It encompasses business payments like just-in-time supplier payments, employee reimbursements, claims, insurance claims, and of course the kind of the big rock, the P2P space. I want to pay my babysitter or pay my colleague for a shower gift, as well as the emergency bill payment scenario. So in that study, those that were identified comprised 12% of payments annually, 29 billion payments in the U.S., and that was the outcome of that. The debate that's underway is, should the criteria essentially prioritize and add higher value or effectiveness for solutions that address current, use case pain points and needs? Should it, take an approach really that the more use cases, the better? How should we approach this aspect? And so what we'd like to do today, the current framework, has some options that are being debated about. It supports, is very effective, that it supports all, or it supports 2 or more, and the scale goes down from there. Your input would be helpful in just, kind of baselining across all possible use cases. Which do you think are priorities or should be served? And maybe you feel that the pain point is around 1 or 2, and that's really how things should be assessed. Or, again, maybe you would think that it was all of them. We should be designing a system that serves any and all. That's where we sort of like your direction at this point. So we're going to move on to polling question number 4. And we've actually divided this to make it easy for you into a response around consumer-oriented use cases and a polling question around business-oriented use cases. So take it away,
right.
Mike.
Very good. So once again, if you minimize the window from before, you can pull that back up and take a look at that next question. If not, I'm actually going to push it again here and see if it pops up on your screen in case you accidentally closed it. Let me read that now. It says, which consumer-oriented use cases do you think would would most benefit from a faster payment solution? And again, check all that apply here. P2P transfers, for example, paying a friend. P2B, reoccurring, so bill payments. P2B, remote real-time, emergency bill payment. P2B, remote time delay, online purchases. P2B, in-person, and that would be point of sale as an example. So go ahead and, again, make your multiple choice options there, and then just go ahead and minimize that again. We're going to come back with one more poll here in just a little bit. All right. And with that said, I think we can turn it back to you, Connie.
All right. Well, we're going to move directly on to the next polling question on slide 16, which is about which business-oriented use cases do you think would most benefit from a faster payment solution? And again, this is a check all that apply.
Great. So once again, bring that poll right back up and make your selections there. It says, which business-oriented use cases do you think would most benefit from a faster payment solution? Okay, so that's B2B low value, for example, just-in-time supplier payment. B2B high value, an example there is large capital good purchases. C says B2B reoccurring, example there is utility payments. B2B low value, and that's employee reimbursements. B2P, I should say, high value, that's medical insurance claims. Or B2P reoccurring, Social Security payments. So at that point, that's going to round out the multiple choice polling questions that we have. So if you kind of review all of those, go ahead and click the Submit button at the bottom there, and that will send us your information. There's also an open text box there at the bottom if you wanted to supply us with some additional comments too. And if you could do that, that would be great. And we're going to not be able to show you those results right now, but we are going to tally those and make those available to our presenter later. All right, so let's take it back to the slides.
Great. Let's move on to slide 17 and our next criteria. So, of course, this is the Faster Payments Task Force, and these are Faster Payments Effectiveness criteria. So we have 4 criteria that focus on speed, and they encompass and evaluate the length of time it takes following payment initiation for authorization, clearing, end-user funds availability, and settlement. So one criteria for each of those. It's helpful to look at these collectively and kind of get your feedback on the end-to-end process in aggregate, how fast do you believe it should be. You can see the way the effectiveness scales are designed. It essentially sets out as ideal that the end-to-end process, including all of those components, happens instantaneously. We're going to ask you today about, what should that end-to-end process be? How fast should it be? Does it need to be? But this suggests that the ideal is that they all happen at the same time. Now, in reality, we know that there are implications, for systems and processes, costs, implementation timeline, for speeding each and every component. And depending on the use cases or what you think the most critical needs are, you may not think that all of these components need to happen at the same speed. And so that's why we've designed separate criteria for each of these, because at the end of the day, you may feel that, authorization and clearing or funds availability needs to happen at a certain speed, but we can accommodate some risk by having settlement happen less frequently. I think that's the typical scenario that's described, and that's how many of the real-time systems around the world operate. So some guidance from you, on this. Again, this is an example of one of those use case or one of the criteria that has real interdependencies, and it's hard to think about it without thinking about use cases or costs or implementation timeline. But from a pure speed perspective, what do you think is important? And that's what we're looking for today. So let's go to the next polling question, which on slide 18, which asks, what is an acceptable speed for sending a payment to another person or company and having the funds show up in their account using a faster payment solution? So this is really asking about those first three: authorization, clearing, and availability. It sort of leaves settlement off the table, but how fast do you think end users should experience the clearing of a faster payment? And
all right, very good. Yeah, so that just, I'm sorry about that, Connie. That did just pop up on the screen, and again, I just want to make sure you understand that this one is one that it's one option only. So we're using the polling tool within the webinar again. And so let me read that. It says, what is an acceptable speed for sending a payment to another person or company and have the funds show up in their account using a faster payment solution? And again, one choice here is within 2 seconds, another is within 5 seconds, within 30 minutes, or on the same day the payment was sent. And go ahead and make your selection there. And this one we will be able to share the results with you. But while I'm going to pause there and give you an opportunity to respond, it might be a good time to ask a question. And if I could, let me go ahead and ask this one. It says, what can I do to support the Fed in moving faster for a faster payments solution?
So that's a great question. And, a couple of comments I would make in response to that. One, the task force is working under a very aggressive timeline. I think if you talk with the folks who are participating, you would hear that things are moving fairly quickly. As I noted, in 90 days, we've essentially produced, when you see it, a 40 or 50-page document articulating the diverse perspectives of, every type of stakeholder in the payment system. And so a lot of work going on behind the scenes that might not be visible if you're not participating. How you individually can help provide input. If you want to even still, get in, there is still, I think, an opportunity for you to actually participate and register for the task force. But I think, and share your opinions even about urgency and timeline with task force members or with the Fed. And if there are ideas for how we can accelerate things or meet needs that you don't see are on our docket, we're very open to that feedback. I think, though, the task force members have said there is a sense of urgency, but it's also really important, given the influence that this work could have on the marketplace and where we end up, that it's really important to be thoughtful about it as well. And I think when you dig into, we're talking about a few of the tough issues today, but when you read the criteria document, I think you will really appreciate the complexity and the challenge of wrestling with these issues, and then beyond, discussing them, trying to come to consensus about what's needed across a very diverse group of stakeholders. So thank you for the feedback. We do feel a sense of urgency, and your involvement and feedback through mechanisms like this will help to bring things to closure, to help drive, to consensus. So encourage you to stay involved.
All right, thank you, Connie. And I know we just have 5 minutes left in our scheduled time, so let me just quickly show the results there on screen. Looks like we have some folks mixing between 5 seconds and 30 minutes. That's pretty interesting. Thank you for that. So let me jump back to the slides here.
All right, our last issue. With our last 5 minutes, let's hit on one that we could probably have, an all-day roundtable discussing and debating, and that is governance. The criteria are looking to describe a requirement for inclusive governance. To us in the document, it means that the decision and rulemaking processes they support the solutions objectives, they're transparent. We are wrestling with how to articulate the importance of or the desire for representation of stakeholders and influence, that stakeholders have an opportunity to influence decision-making and governance. It also would seek to ask how the mechanism prevents disproportionate influence and manages conflict of interest. Really sticky, issues. We also want proposals to speak to mechanisms for considering the public interest, and the interests of different stakeholders, whether it's through representation or influence, but how would operators, end users, financial institutions, non-bank providers, others participate in the governance system? So we've lots of debate going on. There's discussion about checks and balances. When the discussion around representation has talked about, has largely focused on how can you align representation with the level of interest and risk that stakeholders have in the system. And so tough issues. Today, to get some feedback from you and your opinions on this issue, we want to understand on slide 20 whether you feel that aside from representation, solutions should have a governance model that creates a mechanism for stakeholders to influence outside of the governance body or official representation. Is that important that there's a mechanism for influence outside of that? And the poll should have popped up now.
All right, yep, there it is. And there's that question asking representation on the governance bodies currently outlined based on stakeholder groups' risk and interest. Should the faster payment solution also include a mechanism for stakeholders to influence decisions aside from the governance body, for example, an advisory group? So there's a simple yes-no there, and let me just give you a moment to read that over, collect your thoughts, and make your selection. And I'm going to go ahead and stop that in just a few seconds. All right, let me stop that now and share those results.
All right, that's pretty overwhelming support for some kind of influence mechanism. So thank you for that feedback, and let me move on to slide 21, which is our closing. We're bumping up against the hour. I want to, close with emphasizing the opportunity to get involved, and appreciated the question of what can I do, because we really would like you to continue to track what's going on and to weigh in. As much as we are thrilled and feel like 320 people is a lot of representation and lots of perspectives on the task force, it's just a drop in the industry universe, and all of you and folks who are not participating directly in the task force have a big stake in this and will have a big role to achieving the desire to have an ubiquitous implemented capability. So participate in the survey, register so that you can stay posted and you get things hot off the press. I will stay on. We have one more polling question to just get a sense from you about your interest in actively participating moving forward. And then even though we're going over, if you've asked a question, I am happy to stay on for a few minutes, answer some questions. If you have to drop or we don't get to your question, I am happy also we'll follow up offline with you to make sure we get you answers.
All right, very good. And that last polling question just popped up on screen. Let me read that very quickly here. Based on what you've learned in the webinar today, you would, and then your options are, plan to actively support task force efforts and encourage others to get involved, will actively follow work and provide input along the way, support pursuing a faster payments capability but do not plan to actively follow this work, support pursuing a faster payments capability but do not agree with the approach described, or do not value or support pursuing a faster payments capability. So again, we appreciate your input and feedback there. Again, if you have to drop off, we understand, but by all means, please stay on for a few more minutes and we can address some questions if there are some. So let me real quick show the results here of that poll. So it looks like the vast majority are going to actively follow work and provide input along the way, which is great. All right, so again, understanding that some folks may have to drop, let me start with a question here that says, I noticed none of the use case talks about domestic versus international payments. To date, are you only focused on domestic solutions, or are you also considering international solutions?
That's a great question, and a little bit of the bleed across criteria. You'll notice under ubiquity there is a specific criteria about cross-border payments, and again, establishing the ideal that solutions would enable, to some extent, cross-border payments. And so it gives proposals the opportunity to talk about interoperability. That gets over to format standards and efficiency. So there's interoperability, format standards, cross-border. There are several criteria that help to articulate this desire for enablement of cross-border payments. So yes, I think the task force members feel that that's important and are looking for solutions and approaches that address that need.
All right, very good. Let me read another one here. Are B2C and B2B requests for payments, including billing and invoice information, included in the use cases?
Yes. So I think in the list you've got a couple of B2B things, and again we're asking for input there to understand what use cases should be priority or in scope as we evaluate alternative faster solutions. The criteria specifically gets at the importance of some of that with things like contextual data, under efficiency, format standards, exceptions and investigations, under speed, prompt visibility of status, end-to-end. So there are quite a few criteria that get at the importance of the data that travels along with the payment and some of the other aspects that are key to moving B2B payments to electronics.
All right, very good. And another one says, where can I find a list of task force members?
Great question. fedpaymentsimprovement.org. Right now, all of the task force information is under Get Involved. In the menu bar at the top, there's a drop-down, and for both faster payments and secure payments task forces, there is a sub-menu choice there that has the roster. So you can see the roster, you can see the steering committee members. I will give you a heads up that now as the task forces are generating lots of work, we are working on some adjustments to our website and how it's organized so that we can make it really easy for you to find that information. But for now, Get Involved, Faster Payments Task Force, the roster is there.
All right, very good. So we do have some other questions that I think we're going to go ahead and just get replies back to you either via email or maybe a phone call along those lines. If you do have questions, feel free to submit them. We will get them in the hands of our presenters. So with that said, we are a few minutes over, and I think it's probably a good time to wrap up. Thanks for joining us today, especially on a Friday. Special thank you to Connie Theien for her time and everyone else in making these sessions happen. So with that said, have a great day, everybody. We'll catch you next time.